Ah, there it is. Click. And we're live. It is Friday, Sunday, sorry, May 23rd, 2021, 5:02 p.m., but not in Iceland. What is where it's 9:02 p.m. Kate, give us a tour. Oh, there's
Yeah.
Tomas. Hello, Tomas.
I'm going to give you the 360. So, we are in the middle of nowhere in Iceland. It is 9 o'clock and it is still sunny out and it is beautiful. We had a gorgeous day today. And then this is just, yeah, that's the house, the main house. That's our little house for the night. And, yeah. So it is. I had a mystery guest, but she got impatient and left. Cat, and now I'm like significantly colder that I'm not holding a cat on my lap. And I was like, so that was actually like a nice heat source. But yeah, no, it's gorgeous here. We had a great day. I would highly recommend this. There's no one here. Like I went to the Law Rock. I want to do the monologue band about the Law Rock.
Yeah,
Which,
do the
hi,
monologue
Corey.
about the Law Rock.
Okay,
Hello,
so I
my
don't know.
friend.
I don't know if you remember, if everyone remembers the long spiel that the tale, the Ben wrote one about a thing about and the shift, the spot in the tectonic plates where the tectonic plates meet in Iceland, and there's just this massive upheaval of like the earth, and there's this sheer kind of very dramatic black cliff.
And I said
And
that if
this is
I
where
were a Viking and I needed a spot where law emanated, kind of like Kori Shaki has in her kitchen,
The item of
a
extraordinary
an
magic.
item of extraordinary magic from which all gravity in the universe radiates. If I were a medieval Viking and I saw this spot and I was looking for a spot that represented law, I would say this is where we're going to read all the laws every year.
Yeah, all things being equal, it's like perfectly good. But it was also just like a wall, like a rock of a wall rock. Like it wasn't that big a deal. And
Oh, it's
like
such
it
a big
was,
deal. You're not
it was
thinking like a
very very
medieval
pretty. But
Viking.
sure, not sure. I'm not sure. No, I'm not. I'm proud of that. That's okay. Like I think that's like not something I'm ashamed of. So, but it was a really great day, and we had a lot of fun. And there's almost no one here, and everything is like the weather is like very very nice. So and Eurovision was a blast last night. That little party was like a little mini Super Bowl party, and it was super super fun, and I've never watched it before, and it was just a hoot. So yeah.
All of which is a long way of saying that fun is returning. We are sort of allowed to have fun again, at least under certain circumstances. But one of the things that happened today was that I told Kate, because she was off this week having fun in Iceland in violation of the rules of In Lieu of Fun, I would take care of mystery guest duties. So I brought you people not one mystery guest, not two mystery guests, but three mystery guests. Pete Struck, President Tomas Ilves, and Her Royal Majesty Kori Shaki. Sorry, I had to add something to it. And I thought, what is the thing that brings them all together that all three of them would plausibly talk about? And I thought to myself, Belarus. Because, like, you know, as if a gift from the gods, President Lukashenko decided this would be good day to ground an international flight. And this brings together all of their expertise. Tomas, you have been tweeting about this. If you're not following Tomas's Twitter feed on this subject, you really should. So get us started, Tomas. What is President Lukash, your former colleague, President Lukashenko, up to?
Well, there was an internal EU flight that happened to pass over non-EU territory. As far as, I mean, it seems what happened was, I mean, they first of all, Belarus or KGB or FSB or SVR spies knew that this Belarusian journalist was in Greece and about to fly, so they acquired that information from somewhere. Apparently, boarding on the same plane were several uh, agents who, when they were flying over Belarus territory, claimed there was a bomb on board. And then the Minsk, capital of Belarus, air control people said the plane had to divert to Minsk, even though they were closer to its final EU destination, which was Vilnius, and then escorted by Belarus fighter planes. It landed. The Belarus journalist who was taken off the plane, as was his girlfriend, and also four Belarus Russian, it's not clear, passport holders, also decided to stay there. All of the passengers were strip searched, according to one guy who came, one Lithuanian who managed to fly on later when the plane was released. Uh, the the journalist himself, his things were thrown on the tarmac and he was taken off. He was shaking when before he landed, saying they're going to kill me. Given the behavior of the Lukashenko regime, he's probably no longer in very good shape at this point. And then what I have also been writing about is that given the past performance of the European Commission, its external foreign ministry, as it were, it's the European External Action Service, and of the Council, which is meeting tomorrow to discuss Russia anyway, has not been real great. And basically, in response to virtually everything else that's happened that Russia has done or Belarus has done, they have only put out statements of grave or extreme or serious concern. And at this point, I think that many people are at a breaking point in response to the inaction or the sort of wimpy actions of the EU. And we'll see what happens tomorrow. But in any case, this is, I mean, this is kind of like if you're flying from I don't know, New York to Washington state over Canadian territory, and somehow the Canadian government were to force a U.S. plane to land. I mean, this is an internal flight of an internal EU flight with a plane that's an EU country owned and EU registered plane, almost completely filled with EU citizens. So this is like basically air piracy, sort of like War of 1812 stuff.
So,
That's for Corey.
Corey and Pete, can either of you think of a prior incident like this in international affairs? Because I can't.
Mm. There was one, not quite the same, but it was when Evo Morales' plane was refused landing in the European Union, at least by some EU countries, because there was a thought that Edward Snowden was on it and we have to land somewhere. But they did not search the plane in that case either. I mean, it was just countries just wouldn't allow
it to land, rather than forced it to land. That's actually kind of different. But I cannot think of a prior example, either as a matter of international affairs or of law enforcement, where Ryanair is an Irish airline, right? Is running a flight from one EU country to another EU country. So uh, a one EU country has an airline, runs a flight from a second EU country to a third EU country. A non-EU country forces it down on a pretext of a bomb threat by way of arresting a political dissident. Can
And the
either of
plane is registered in a fourth EU country, Poland.
that I didn't know. Okay, can any of you think of an analog to that?
No, no, I can't.
No. And it was close, right? I mean, Vilnius was like, I'm looking at a
It
map,
was
like
closer
40,
to
45
Vilnius
miles
than
away.
it was to Minsk.
I mean, I mean, but like 45, that's like almost going on final. And Minsk was 100 miles. So it was like twice as far. And if you look at the track, I mean, it's going straight north and it's literally 5-10 miles from hitting Lithuanian airspace. So it's, clearly the pretext is bizarre. No, and following up on President Ilves, I'm very curious to see what, Athens historically has been a somewhat porous airport security-wise. They got better post 9/11, but it's still within the EU, probably not at the high end of the scale security-wise. And so in my mind, the question is to what extent these were Belarusian intel service folks, private or not, or equally as likely, I think, whether you get the same rogues gallery of the GRU knuckleheads that have been running roughshod all over EU and adding to that sort of what I would imagine outrage on the part of a lot of EU states. At what point do you let these essentially, they're not even covert action, they're overt actions by the the government of Russia and its intelligence service and proxies to take very direct, in some cases lethal action on all this EU territory. I'm curious, President Ilves and Corey, what do you think, in my mind, makes it much, Nord Stream 2 is in trouble, and to the extent that the Biden administration was trying to split the baby and maybe not be as aggressive on sanctions, I think this really puts them in a much tougher spot. And I'm wondering what you think about the future impact of this on that, and also kind of the German perspective on Russian relations compared to the rest of the EU.
So I may be the only American who thinks it's time to give up our opposition to Nord Stream 2 for two reasons. The first is that EU energy market reforms in the last 10 years have done an enormous positive amount to limit Russia's ability to use energy as a weapon against countries. And second, because I think the US and the Biden administration in particular at the moment have the tendency to tell others they need to take big, difficult domestic policy decisions that we're not willing to make on issues like trade policy. And so I actually think we ought to dial down our demands on Nord Stream, and instead, as it looked like the Biden administration was about to do, to shift our policy towards asking in return for Nord Stream 2 going ahead, concrete efforts to increase the security of our formerly Eastern European and Baltic allies who are really nervous about this. That, I think, I wouldn't want to see it connected to the behavior of Belarus here. What I would love to see happen here is to immediately treat Belarus's airspace as though it were a war zone. That is, no civilian flights go in or out of there, nor cross their airspace, nor should we allow Belarusian airlines to operate in our own airspace, because the behavior of, as Thomas said, this is air piracy. And we ought to treat it as such and treat the government of Belarus as an outlaw state until it repairs what they have just done.
So I want to focus here. We have three distinct governance perspectives. A European head of state, Corey, who has worked at the State Department, the Defense Department, and most importantly, I think for this purpose, the NSC, and Pete, who has actually knows a little something about law enforcement and Russian counterintelligence. So I want to treat each of these distinctly, and I want to start with you, Corey. If you are on the NSC today, do you look at this and say, meh, the world is a complicated, nasty place. This is an EU-Belarus problem. Let Tomas handle it. Or Tomas's counterparts. Or do you look at this and say the U.S. has a big dog in this situation? And so how are you organizing U.S. government response by way of advising the president on how to think about this?
Can I add a quick follow-on to Corey, which is when you were talking about not allowing any more Belarusian flights in or anything, do you think that it should be confined to that level of sanction, or do you think it should be even broader than that? And also, do we have an idea of what type of economic harm it would actually do to, like, how big a market would we be cutting them off from if we did just make that one broad rule?
So I don't know the answer to your last question, Kate. I don't know how much economic impact it would have on Belarus, but I think the political isolation is more important. To answer Ben's question, capable as Tumas Ilves is, I nonetheless would not leave this to him as a problem for three reasons. The first is because, my experience on alliance relations has been that when the United States steps back, our allies step back further, and that it's precisely in moments like this where sharing the risk builds credibility and solidarity. And it's really important for the US, which is a country that can't and shouldn't be intimidated by Belarus, to not let anybody else be intimidated either. And the Russians are clearly going to stand behind Belarus on this. And so not letting them cast that shadow, I think, is really important. The second reason is that, we say we want a rules-based international order. And the rules are you can't interfere with a civilian flight, force it to the ground, and remove political dissidents. And we need to stand up for and enforce the rules because the reason the international order the United States and its friends created in the aftermath of World War II has been so secure, so prosperous, and so inexpensive for the United States and its friends to maintain is because the rules aren't just good for us, they're good for smaller countries that don't have the ability to withstand Russian and Belarusian intimidation. And the third reason is Belarus is, like a lot of rinky-dink authoritarian countries, it's the testing ground for things other authoritarians will try if we allow it to occur there. So with apologies for the analogy, it is kind of like broken windows policing. That is, we got to stop it where it happens before bigger, stronger criminals and authoritarians start to think this is a useful thing to do.
All right, so Tomas, if you were in office today, it seems to me you've got two giant problems on your hands. One is that the EU does everything by consensus, and the other is that the leverage over Belarus is just not that great. So I'm going to ask you to be a different Baltic president here. You're the closest thing to the Lithuanian president. We've got different language group and all that, but you're closer than any of us. So what is the fundamental orientation of the Lithuanian government today, and how does that interact with their ability to get anything done through the EU about this?
Well, actually, Lithuania, I'm almost embarrassed to say, has been at the forefront, the number one country standing up for human rights and freedom in Belarus. The president of Lithuania, President Nausėda, already announced that tomorrow's EU Council meeting will have to take actions on what Belarus did today. I mean, he's really out there, far ahead of everyone else. I mean, in fact, the EU Council president 5 hours said he's very concerned. I mean, just more of the same. So now, the thing about the consensus that's required for EU foreign policy actions, in some senses, has become very. The need for consensus has become shaky thanks to Hungary's actions in the last 2 weeks, which is to veto EU positions on China and Hong Kong and Iran. And the response of the rest of the EU is, okay, you can do that. 26 of us have this position. And in fact, when it comes to many of the actions that are possible now, it is actually a national decision on whether or not to allow planes in or not. Either Belavia, which is the Belarus plane, or planes flying to Belarus. Francis Heisburg, a Swiss-French foreign policy expert, actually proposed just refusing to let any commercial traffic in from Belarus into the 3 countries that border Belarus, with EU countries that are Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, which would be far more devastating than even the effect of boycotting a state-owned airline as Belavia. So there are many things. The other thing I also want to point out, just as a footnote, which I think Corey would remember, which is that in 1993, or if it was 94, there was 2 American balloons, which were part of like this European like air balloon thing, like the Montgolfier brothers or whatever. And they actually had permission to go into Belarus, but Lukashenko, this is like soon after he assumed power, he sent jets to shoot them down, and a number of Americans were killed. I mean, this is not a difficult target. I have no
memory of that.
I don't either.
Someone can Google it while
I'm Lukashenko shooting down balloons. There
were hot air balloons with Americans inside them. Or underneath them. But anyway, they were killed. 2 or 3 people died.
Wow.
That way.
So
it was a big stink.
When was this?
93 or so.
93, Pete, 94.
I want to ask you what is going on in U.S. law enforcement today, because on the one hand, you look at this and you say, all right, whatever this is, air piracy, as Tomas calls it, but it's not like somebody hijacked a plane. It's actually an act of state. It's sort of state, not even sponsored air air piracy. It's state engaged in. So
it's War of 1812.
Yeah, exactly. So should we assume
letters of marque? Let's go.
Right. Should we assume that the FBI looks at this and says, not our problem, even if there are Americans on board, it's not really our business? Or should we assume that they look at it and they say, hey, if there are Americans on board, you've got a potential predicate for a criminal investigation? Or should we look at it, should we assume they look at it and say, probably not a criminal thing, but boy, is this interesting what the Russians are doing, because the Belarusians don't do anything without Moscow's permission. What's going on the 7th floor of the FBI today?
So I think you have both those things going on. The first is getting a manifest and figuring out whether or not there are any American citizens on board, because that typically is going to be what triggers a criminal offense if there is one. And it's not clear to me that this wasn't a terrorist hijacking; it was a state act, and it isn't clear to me, since they were detained and released, whether or not there's a criminal violation. But I mean, that will be one question to figure out whether or not there is a criminal violation. But I think much more important is, to the extent that there is, the intelligence question, particularly about what the Russian involvement was or wasn't, whether this was just some sort of tacit approval of a Belarusian action. But when it comes to the response of the U.S. government and the EU being able to say this was strictly a Belarusian act versus something that was a Russian state-sponsored act, that broadens the aperture of whatever response that the U.S. or EU might try to do. So there is plenty of investigation to be had, and so that can be, step back and say, okay, let's go to Athens now. Obviously, the U.S. government is in Athens. The State Department is there. Presumably, the U.S. intelligence community is there. Certainly, the FBI has a legal attaché. And they all have various liaison relationships. And so the question is, what are the Greeks going to do? And if what President Ilves was saying is right, I mean, it was a big footprint, right? I mean, if they had 4 people on the plane who were presumably Belarusians or agents willing to travel, presumably if it didn't go off successfully, they're willing to land in Lithuania and find their way home, wherever that may be. The infrastructure that it takes to support a group of that many people and getting them on a plane, the coordination of where they knew that Protasevich was, which flight he was on. I think there was some indication that there were tweets that he said when he was checking in, somebody behind him was trying to photograph his boarding pass. So there is a footprint there that leaves a trace. And so whether those are email communications, telephone communications, billing records at hotels, the way they paid for the transportation, the way they came in, where they ate, all that stuff is available. So a threshold question is what the Greeks are going to do, how aggressive they're going to be, whether it's going to get done by the law enforcement agencies or by the intelligence services or both. And all of those may or may not be interested. Those all have discrete relationships with their U.S. counterparts. In some nations, people are very, very tight. The local services are very tight, let's say the CIA. In other instances, they have great relationships with the FBI because they have different sorts of roles and responsibilities. And so there potentially will be engagement there. And again, the reason that is so critical is there is information to be gotten, and particularly to the extent that that points to the level and type of Russian involvement. And it doesn't have to be either Russians or Belarusians. It could be Belarusians aided by Russian signals intelligence. They're up on the individual's email, or they're monitoring their cellular communications, and they pass that to these Belarusian operatives. There are any number of things that can exist, but to the extent that I would hope the EU is placing some pressure on Greece to get to the bottom of it. I mean, Russia was all over the Montenegrin elections when 3-4 years ago, whenever that was. But I mean, they've just been running roughshod. They were all over Switzerland looking at the dope testing labs and doing other things. They obviously were active in the UK, but this is not Russian willingness to engage in very aggressive state action in the EU is something that will be impacted by whatever the truth of Russian involvement was in this. So the short answer, Ben, is both those things are going on. I wouldn't be surprised if there's not much of a criminal angle. But then the other thing is, so say the Greek, I don't know what their national service is, if they have a national police service, and I don't know whether or not they would ever come to the U.S. and say, we found these 4 drop phones in the trash can at the Athens airport. Can you help us forensically exploit them? Now, why they would choose to ask the U.S. that versus France or the UK or anybody else, I don't know. But there potentially is that sort of offer of assistance in an investigative matter that also might be going. But the much more interesting from a intel and policy perspective is what's going on that intel side.
So are any of you hopeful about how this is going to end up? To just kind of like skip to the punchline, do you think that this is going? So Corey, you've told us what they think they should do. Tomas has told us what he thinks they should do. There's been this. There's not much daylight between the two of you. It seems to me that there is. But what is the likelihood of kind of some of those things happening? Do you have any idea?
I think there's a pretty good likelihood of denying. I think there's a very high likelihood of nobody transiting Belarusian airspace because they're a demonstrated threat to civil aviation. I'd say there's a 7 in 10 chance that the EU and NATO countries won't permit their aircraft landing in Belarus or vice versa. I think there's probably a 90% probability of slapping more economic sanctions on people. And Bellingcat will tell us in a couple of days who these guys are and where they live. And
Yeah, they're
so
my heroes. They do amazing.
I agree. They make it possible for our intelligence agencies not to reveal sources and methods, and yet publicly hold people accountable, which I think is a great force for good.
We should have a Bellingcat show, actually. We should bring some Bellingcat people on.
I've been arguing you need Elliot Higgins on there for months.
I yield to your judgment. It's time.
So Tomas, I want to ask you a separate question too. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Corey.
Nope, go ahead.
No. I finished what you were saying because I will ask what I was going to also specifically ask Tomas. But I was remembering as I was saying this, it relates to my question of how bad will it be to cut off the aviation in Belarus, like economically to them. I'm just remembering one of the things that Tomas says so often, which is just kind of like, if you really want to hurt these authoritarian governments, if you really want to do these things, you go after their pocketbooks, you cut off their access to like cultural elite activities in the US or like things to that extent, which I think is a tremendous point. And I'm just kind of curious, it's like if they do all of those things, I agree that they're very important things to do, but like besides sanctions, I just feel are so like end up hurting, obviously, like they don't hurt people.
Oops.
I would argue that one thing you can do in the United States is what the UK has now passed a law on, though I don't think they're really enforcing it for some reason, which is that when you have enormous wealth and you have to with real estate and you're a foreigner, you have to prove that you got that money legitimately. I mean, they've actually gone after non-Russians, more like sort of Central Asian state people, but I mean, clearly Central Asian, close to dictators people who own multi-million-dollar real estate in London did not get it from their business acumen. But that is a law on the UK books. I think you need one in the United States today, because even the guy who boasted about stopping the U.S. adoptions of U.S. orphans did it at a time when, as a member of the State Duma, he had a $2.9 million condo in Miami. So, I mean, and the U.S. is full of these clowns, right?
If you want, I've been saying this for years, if you want to do something about global kleptocracy, international money laundering enforcement and improvement of laws is the thing.
And
I want to go.
Transparency, force the acknowledgments. That's why Alexei Navalny is so powerful, because he's arming Russians with the information to hold their government accountable. And the more we can do that, the more ways that we can force light to shine in those dark corners, whether it's just public attention or whether it's legal ramifications, the safer we all are.
So I have tried to bring Tim Smythe on to ask this question. I have not been able to, so I'm just going to read it. He asks about first impressions of this airline incident in terms of what violations and consequences of international law there might be. I will just say on this, I think it's probably, like, I am not an expert on, by any means, on international law of aviation, which is a complicated area. It is inconceivable to me that a fictitious bomb threat to ground a plane in transiting airspace does not run riot over a number of Belarus's international obligations. That said, I cannot cite you chapter and verse. If any of you guys have more detail on that, feel free. But that's, I mean, other than the certainty that it violates international law on a number of points, I'm not sure I can tell you more than that.
So at a minimum, they have to be signatories of the treaty that says you, once given permission of transit to your through your airspace, you will not harass civilian aircraft or interfere with them in any way.
So really quickly, am I misremembering? Wasn't Janet Yellen talking about ending tax havens in like a global, calling for a global end to tax havens like a couple of months ago, and that just like disappeared? Like, and Tomas, is that kind of to an extent?
I think the administration.
Sorry,
no,
Corey?
no, no, no. Go ahead, Corey.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
I'm glitching a little. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to talk over you.
I was just going to say,
Go ahead, Corey.
I'm sorry. I too didn't mean to interrupt. I don't think it has disappeared. I do actually think the Biden administration believes one of the ways we are going to pay for the infrastructure bill and other things is foreclosing the shopping market of tax havens. But it'll be hard in the EU, given Ireland's the major destination for a lot of that, and they're going to have to agree to it. But we should still do it.
I agree. I think, getting some degree of, leave aside how you're going to finance domestic spending, that's that may or may not be a Biden administration delusion to avoid raising taxes or to avoid, dealing with the complexities of how you're going to fund the spending that you're proposing. The idea that we should have an international competition for sort of least common denominator tax havens for major organized crime and outfits, and more generally rich people who don't want to pay taxes in their home countries, strikes me as something that the international community, at least the civilized parts of it, should be able to get together on. Matthew Allen, you have a question for Corey.
I do. It's a little off topic, but any opportunity to ask Corey a question on this topic, I'll have to take. I was wondering if you are concerned about some of the shifts in the civil-military relations in the United States and whether we might.
Can you guys hear him and I just can't?
I can hear him. Matthew, finish your question and I will translate it for Corey.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering if Corey was concerned about some of the shifts in the civil-military relations in the United States and whether we might be seeing an erosion of civilian control, given the consecutive waivers for former generals to head the DoD, and just some of the demographic imbalances in the ranks and just the general shifts in civil-military relations.
Great question, if wholly off topic today. Corey, Matthew asks how concerned you are about shifts in civil-military relations given A, the changes in demographics among the troops, and B, the serial waivers given to former generals to be heads of the Defense Department.
Not very, although I agree that the two so-called waivers, which are actually passage of legislation to permit a recently retired general to run the Defense Department, has probably destroyed the norm of a gap before retirement. And I think the result is that you will have less qualified secretaries of defense because they won't have the kind of diverse experience that makes for better leadership of the institution. Right? The reason the prohibition was put in place was to have a sort of cooling off period. So you had to get to know people who weren't in the military, and you had to have other kinds of experience, run a civilian company, run for office. And so what we're seeing is a narrowing of the experience of secretaries to nothing more than military service, when you already have about 1.2 million people in the American military who could give you military judgment on problems. But the point is that politicians are going to hide behind uniforms for as long as uniforms remain popular with the American public. And so, Michael Flynn and John Allen are doing some great service for civil military relations by reminding us that there are deep partisanship and even idiocy, even in the high ranks of our military, because they are an extension of our society, not, comic book heroes who leap tall buildings in a single bound. But no, I'm not particularly worried about it. You've seen in the last 2 years, for example, a 14-point drop in public admiration for our military. And that's the result of highly visible politicized activism by veterans.
All right, Matteo, your question could go to any of our three guests. So why don't you name two of them that you want to hear from on this question, and we'll let them both address it.
Jeez, tough choice.
Yeah, who are you going to exclude?
I guess I'm going to exclude. I'm going to exclude Mr. Struck. Although I have to say, while I have the opportunity, you have far and away the best background of anyone I've seen this year. So, just putting that out there.
Flattery will not save you. You're going to get a visit from the bureau for excluding Struck from the question.
Well, is what it is, I guess. My question comes from the fact that I'm having just such a difficult time parsing the rationale behind this action. Like, what is this fact that they're willing to do such an outrageous thing to arrest a blogger, tell us about what's going on at the highest levels of Belarusian government?
So, Tomas, why don't you get us started on that?
Well, he was behind the most successful independent television.
Once again, I couldn't hear the question.
Oh, I'm not sure why you're having trouble hearing our guests, our others, but the question is, what does the action is so outrageous? What were the cost benefit? What might the cost benefit analysis have looked like in the Lukashenko government to make this look like a plausibly sane thing to do?
Well, it's one of these, why a blogger, but he's much more than a blogger. He was really behind the most successful independent alternative television station that, using various means, got all kinds of extremely embarrassing footage of the behavior of the Lukashenko regime, especially last year, immediately after the falsified election. So, I mean, they really dislike him because he made clear to the world what Lukashenko was doing.
Corey, do you have thoughts on this?
I do. My first reaction is we shouldn't presume that they are operating on a logic recognizable to us. That there's always a temptation to do that in war and foreign policy. And it's entirely possible we have no idea why they're doing what they're doing. If I were guessing what they were doing, I would agree with Tomas that what they are trying to do is prevent visibility into Belarus. They don't want the protesters seen. They don't want information getting out. That would be my guess. And we're banking on short attention spans on our part, right? We may be outraged, but how long are we going to let this drive other topics off the news? How long can we keep our focus on the erosion of our values and our laws? So that would be my guess. If I were Belarusian government, I would already have killed him so that they cannot be asked to hand him over and, tripped falling down the stairs while in police custody. It's a time-honored authoritarian tactic.
Yeah,
I work for him. Enterprising Belarusians who don't start what their government is doing to be witness. And is that
so we are losing Corey. Corey's audio. I'm going to try to improve that. I think there is just a connectivity issue for Corey. In the meantime, Charles, you have a question for Mr. Struck.
I do. So I guess my main question is, does the FBI need or have a transnational repression unit, or a unit that deals with transnational repression cases, particularly in view of transnational repression being an increasing problem around the world, whether it's this recent case in Belarus or, the Khashoggi case or other, prominent cases around the world. Are we at that point? And what is what's the best, law enforcement response to situations like this?
Not that I'm aware of. The FBI has provided, we sent over many, many years, a lot of folks into supporting the investigations of war crimes in, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and people providing the forensic analysis of that to support the trials that were going on, and continue, I guess, in some cases. But in most cases, the FBI's criminal investigative activity is driven by violations of U.S. law. So if there isn't a U.S. citizen nexus, that becomes a limiting factor. Now, the exception is certainly support to international organizations, that does occur. Support to allied law enforcement partners, that does occur. Whether or not we need to be doing that, I think that's a tricky. I think anytime you provide sort of anything beyond very specialized forensic assistance to an international organization rather than a discrete state, that becomes complicated. DOJ has mutual legal assistance treaties where if a foreign nation asks the U.S. for assistance, they're treaties or they're formal agreements made, in which case the U.S. can provide that assistance. And when you get outside of a state in that context to an international organization, that becomes more complex. So, again, whether or not we need it, that's a great question. I would have to think about that, but I don't. And everybody's so resource limited anyway that I think that would be another challenging factor. But it's a great question.
As a general matter, the FBI's jurisdiction is limited by the U.S. criminal law. And, if there is not a law that says somebody can't do it, the FBI doesn't have jurisdiction to investigate it. And that's a really important principle, because if you don't have that principle, then the FBI can investigate based on, say, the priorities, the political priorities of the president, which is something you would not want to have been able to happen over the last 4 years, for example. And so it's really important that you don't give the FBI authority over stuff that isn't forbidden by criminal law. Which raises the question that we started with, which is there a plausible criminal law basis for the FBI to be involved in this? And that almost certainly depends on whether were U.S. people on the flight. Is that right? Is that right, Pete?
No, I think that's generally right. The one thing I would add is that legal assistance is very broad and can give rise to some really surprising things. Say the Greeks go out and they find that these guys were all using credit cards that went through a U.S. bank. They might ask through IMLAT or some other formal process, ask DOJ to go out and get that, and the FBI might be involved in saying, okay, they all used making this up, chase credit cards, go out and get those records in a way that would support the Greek investigations. And so a lot of things do occur in that sort of cooperative environment that do, that's not an expansion of the FBI's authorities, but it is, it's mutual, right? We do that because one, just, the good governance and justice purpose of it all, but we also do it because we want them to also do for us the same thing, that if we find, somebody here in the US that's using a Greek state bank credit card, that we can go out and ask for those things. So there are things like that might happen. But generally, you're right. I mean, generally the authorities are tethered to U.S. law. The exception to that are the foreign intelligence and counterintelligence authorities, which are much more, which are greater and different.
Can I ask a question?
No.
That is just like, I know this is, well, it's like unrelated, but I was just thinking about, and I'm sure that this is obviously something that people are thinking about and working on, but just like how time limited is the ability going to be to do that type of kind of investigative work through financial investigations? The more prevalent Bitcoin becomes and the more fungible it becomes across different environments, and I know that's something that crypto security people are thinking about all the time. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
I think it varies on the technique. I mean, there's some things like, communications records are increasingly forever. If they were sending email, if they were, using cell phones that were pinging off cell towers, and the location of that is going to be there for a very long time. Bitcoin is tough to translate into day-to-day expenses. I mean, you can't go into pay for a rental car or a hotel with Bitcoin. You still got to transfer that into currency and use that. So there are some things, particularly electronic records, that are going to be around for a fairly long time. And when I say fairly long, I'm talking months or more. But there's some things, CCTV. If there are hotel cameras, if they're airport cameras, if they're ATM cameras, some of those loop over themselves. And so those, depending on what it is, can have a much shorter lifespan. And then obviously eyewitnesses, you want to get to them as fast as possible. And certainly, the question in my mind would be right now, was there a footprint in Athens that was supporting this operation that didn't get on the plane? So if there are other Belarusians, Russians who were supporting this, who are now hightailing it out of the country, that would be the first order of business, to try and figure out what is in flight, how you identify it and stop it, and whether or not this is the kind of thing to suddenly, increase border transit, 100% interviews of people leaving the country. Anybody with a Belarusian or Russian passport automatically gets pulled into secondary for questions or at border crossings. Those are, and it's right now already too late for that in many cases, but that's something, if you don't get it quickly, you run the risk of losing it.
Corey, I want to give you a chance to restate your answer to the question that we lost you in the middle of. I've been keeping you muted because we're getting an echo. Uh-oh, are we losing you again?
Did you see Tomas's comment in the chat, Ben, that nothing is support for the Biden infrastructure plan, and the fact that he has better internet in the Estonian countryside than Corey does in DC?
I added some exclamation marks to it. I couldn't agree with it more. Tony Cava, while we are trying to get Corey back, the floor is yours.
Okay, I was just sending some snark the president's way after that remark about our internet. Here comes Corey.
Yeah, she's back. Let's try one more time. Corey, I want to give you a chance to restate your answer to the question you were answering when we lost you. Can we hear you? Unmute yourself. Hang on. All right, Tony, go ahead, and I'm going to work on Corey.
Okay, excellent. Mr. Strzok, you might have kind of addressed this earlier, but I'm wondering if, and obviously journalists, Belarusian and Russian journalists are really the ones paying the price for all this. But I'm getting an echo.
Yes, Corey, keep yourself mute. I just muted you. Keep yourself muted until Tony's question is done, and then I'll unmute you.
So Belarusian, and Russian journalists are the ones really paying the price for all this. But I'm just wondering if we, that is Western democracies, the United States, Britain, the EU, are beginning to really pay a price and will continue to pay the price of Trump basically encouraging Khashoggi's murder and countenancing it, and then Biden kind of downplaying it when he had a chance to react. I'm just wondering if the weak reaction to that blatant behavior is kind of leading to this and future actions.
Pete, you wanna give an initial thought on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that it's certainly anytime you have a cost-benefit analysis, if the cost is perceived as low, you don't need much of a benefit to argue in favor of taking the action. So to the extent there's an international, or certainly a Russian or Belarusian expectation that we can operate with relative impunity in Europe and not have much of a sanction for our delict, for whatever we've done wrong, that is going to heighten all the times you're going to say, yes, let's go ahead and do it. So whether that relates, and I love Corey's point about we may well have absolutely no idea about the decision-making dynamic that's going on within bringing down this plane and taking him into custody. So I think in general, it is a fair, in my mind, assumption that, whether it's international behavior, whether it's domestic policing, if there's an expectation of a response that is going to raise the cost of an action, that is going to make you less likely to do it, whether we can extend that and say this is a result of Trump's behavior vis-a-vis the Saudi government, that takes a much brighter political science mind than mine.
All right. I am going to keep the systems working. Wait. Corey, you now have the floor both for your previous answer and for anything you want to say on whether there's a relationship between Khashoggi and this.
I agree completely with the answer Pete just gave, that I think if you're going to murder journalists, torture journalists, force planes down to take journalists, I don't think you are that sensitive as to the consequences. But I agree that the fact that we haven't been responding as stridently as protecting our values and liberties requires of us is a bad thing. But I think it might put too much weight in the bucket to suggest that somehow connects. Even in cases where strong action has been taken against the Russians poisoning a British citizen on British soil several years ago, that didn't stop the Russians from poisoning Navalny, damaging Navalny. It didn't prevent them from doing other things. So I think actually the reason that military people don't like to cut it close is because you want to send a clear signal. You want to have no chance of being misunderstood, precisely so that people can't finesse the message. And I really think we should take strong reaction. The Biden administration and other friendly governments should take very strong reaction about this, whether or not they are trying to reset attitudes about poor responses previously. The action on its own merits a very strong retaliation on our part.
Tomas, finish us up. First of all, should we fundamentally understand this as a Belarusian action or as a Russian action? And do you think that there is, I look at this and I say Putin was doing this sort of thing before Khashoggi was a public name, while he was still living in Saudi Arabia, let alone, he didn't need the Khashoggi incident to teach him that he could get away with something like this. Is there any reason to think this is more connected than my gut suggests?
Well, it probably is connected, given that the 4 people who were on the plane and that remained in Belarus after the hijacking. Sorry, when I hear Russia, I think hacking, hijacking. All had Russian passports, and the other 2 were, of course, Patrushev and his girlfriend, but that they had Russian passports, so they got on. So I mean, Russia's involved one way or another. On the other hand, you can only go on what happened, and what happened was Belarus did this. I mean, I don't have any doubts that this was done with at least the tacit approval of Putin. On the other hand, I mean, there's no point in looking for the big thing. It's bad enough, and I think Putin will take the message that if the West really sits on top of Lukashenko for this, that okay, well, that wasn't such a good idea, even if it was mine, perhaps. But anyway, the point is that, I mean, they can always push back if you'd say, okay, it's Belarus and Russia, we know, and we probably do know. But the point is, let's just get Belarus, make them suffer for this. Would be my bottom line.
We are going to leave it there. Let's get Belarus and make them suffer. It is midnight. Is it midnight in Estonia?
No,
Thomas?
It's 1 a.m.
1 a.m. It's 1 a.m. in Estonia. It's 10 o'clock in Iceland. It is 6 o'clock in the District of Columbia and in the undisclosed location where Pete Strzok lurks. And it is light out in all of the above. So I just want to say that Arctic Circle is a funky thing. We will be back tomorrow. You are all great Americans, particularly Corey Shockey, who has suffered through terrible internet connectivity issues. We love you anyway. Pete, Corey, Tomas, thanks for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow, 22 hours and 57 minutes from now. Kate will be live from the erupting volcano. And until then, Kate, I'm just over-promising for you.
I know. We're not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we're allowed to have a lot of sun, apparently, as we approach the summer solstice. So
we will see you tomorrow. Thanks, guys.
Bye,